All right, man, let's just get in here and do this. This is one I've been looking forward to. So let me intro these guys real quick. And before I do, I preface, we're going to do some work on the Vatican, which is key and central for anyone who caught the Kissinger episode. You shouldn't be in the dark about what role it plays. Problem is we have to do that in hour two. I'd say about 10 minutes after I put Kissinger up, it started getting flagged. So anyhow, welcome, Darren, and welcome, Daryl.
And good morning from Australia.
Morning.
All right, guys, let's kind of start at the basic beginning here so people understand why we're talking to two guys in Australia about the United States Constitution. I found out from speaking with you that the Australian Constitution was modeled on the American Constitution. So can we start there? Can we just jump in and give a quick outline?
Yes, well, the American Constitution did form part of the Australian Constitution, as well as the Constitution of the German Empire and the Constitution of Switzerland. Those three constitutions formed part of the Australian Constitution. We took the power that's stemming from the people and included that power which is mentioned in the Switzerland Constitution and the United States Constitution into the Australian Constitution because the supreme, absolute, uncontrollable authority must at all times stem from the people. So the Australian Constitution really brought that into being through two sections of our Constitution, Section 123 and 128, where the parliaments require the people's permission to adjust the Constitution of the Commonwealth in Section 128. And if there's going to be any changes or limits to any particular state, then the people must give the parliament the approval.
So is the general idea that the founding fathers of the United States kind of did a decent job with the Constitution?
Yeah, they did, although predominantly at the beginning, the United States Articles of Confederation were more or less to break away from from England and from Britain. But of course, you guys have inherited the habeas corpus, which is one of the fundamental rights of the people to have a representation and voice in the courts, in the parliament, and essentially influencing the executive. So the US Constitution really expresses those rights and maintains that power that the people must have influencing their legislators, which has slipped away since the corporate structure really stepped in to take over.
Let's address that for a second. I'm sorry for interrupting, but this is critical because a lot of people who have been listening to the work we've been doing have been saying things like the Constitution was written, it was insider baseball. The thing that matters is the Declaration. They've been saying all these things, but the truth of the matter is the Constitution was written before we had corporations gone wild in this country. And it was also written, I mean, it's so far ago, people were still saying thee and thou. Totally a different world than the corporate world. That's correct, right? That's correct.
But the corporate world was hinted to in the Bill of Rights in England in 1689, 1688. And that's the basic principles of what the corporate world was really about was clearly reflected in that Bill of Rights. And we're now clearly suffering under that. When you read the Bill of Rights, the English Bill of Rights, you can see exactly what this corporate structure is doing to all over the world, to all of us. And we have to be aware of that. And therein lies the devil, which is hidden in that Bill of Rights. The whole structure of that Bill of Rights was to keep away any influence from the Holy See, the Roman Curia, into government, for the purpose of stopping that control mechanism that the corporate structure relied on in order to suppress the people and suppress the people's influence in the legislature and in the courts. So, yeah, it's very powerful. When you read that Bill of Rights, you can better understand where we're really at today.
And of course, we had the influence of one of the earliest mega corporations, which was the East India Company, correct?
Yes, and of course, that's where Australia was essentially settled by the British through that East India Trading Company, which Captain Cook more or less was funded by to get to Australia and to settle it accordingly with the British flag.
So let's just cut to the chase real quick. Like right now, in this moment in time, and by the way, I guess we should cover Australia too, because I think something's happened to your Constitution. Here in the United States, the last president gave lip service to the Constitution, said he'd uphold it and defend it to the best of his ability, whatever the hell that means. But the point here is that if that document was strictly adhered to, a lot of the nonsense that's surrounding us would fall away, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. It's like Australia as well.
Did something happen to your Constitution, by the way? Did they finally take steps to try to bury it?
They've been desperately trying to bury it and the basic principles around it pretty much a couple of years after the Federation at 1900. So it's been poorly interpreted by our courts, poorly interpreted by legislators. They've tried to disassemble it by bringing in other statutes that contradict it. But one of the things that the Australian Constitution and the framers intended was that because the Australian people take a vital role in the structure of that Constitution, they've more or less kept it from the Australian people instead of installing it into our school system, which really should have been, and making sure that every child and everyone in this land understood what that Constitution was about in order to take part in the referendums. Because there's been 48 referendums since Federation, and there's only been 6 that have had a yes, which speaks volumes. The Australian people have just been ignorant of a document that they play a vital role in. And this is why when I saw this 20 years ago, I thought this is crazy. So I started public meetings and just reading through this Constitution and to see if there was any correlation between the Constitution and what's happening today. And of course, we saw this vast chasm take place, and people were just shocked at what was written in there, which dictates what government can and cannot do, and the role that the people must play in that.
What might ring true for your listeners also is, in Australia, I can explain the Australian situation. Since 1973, we've had a corporate government. And what's taken place there, the actual government operate off a general acceptance of a truism. So what's happening is it appears that the political parties have usurped the role of the people in the Constitution. So remove the people, insert the political parties. Now, that hasn't happened on paper, but that's how it appears to be. And what's going on is a lot of the time they will have a referendum and ask the people for a particular change, and the people will say no. And then within 2 to 4 years, what's occurring is they go ahead and do what they asked for and were denied anyway. And what it appears to be is that, the political parties have, all of a sudden, they have actually written themselves into the Constitution, and they're basically, since 1973, with what they did was they removed the Crown of the United Kingdom, and that they removed the power and authority. And since they've removed the power and authority, there has been no power and authority. So they're operating under this
Corporate banner.
Well, corporate banner, yeah. It's a queen that's on paper and not an actual true sovereign being with any power and authority to delegate to the government. So I do believe there's a similar thing occurring in America, where you have this corporate government that operate under the Constitution, as they call it here in Australia, from time to time. So the times they want to operate under the Constitution, they are. Like, for example, in Australia, when they want to remove a particular politician, they engage the Constitution and they remove that particular politician. But the rest of the time, they operate under their corporate statutes that they've written that actually rise above the stream of the Constitution itself. So you've got these corporate statutes that have been written under the Constitution, but they don't comply with the Constitution. All laws in Australia must be subject to the Constitution here. But we have these laws that are not subject to the Constitution. And when you inquire with the government as to those indiscrepancies, that these laws are not subject to the Constitution, they turn their heads and they use the excuse, well, it is generally accepted that this is happening. So once again, they operate off the general acceptance of a truism that the political parties agree to and not the people themselves.
Man, that let me back up. So if I followed that correctly, basically they turned the queen into a straw man or a straw woman, right? That's what you're pointing out there?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, she actually has no power here that she can actually administer. And the power has been completely usurped by the Australian government, because in 1973, the Labor government actually removed the power of the United Kingdom Crown, and they created this new Queen of Australia that was not operating under the power and authority of the United Kingdom Crown. So what's happening is once again, they want us to generally accept this truism that they have some sort of power that's outside of the Crown. Now, the power and authority in the Constitution, there is but one power, and that is the Crown of the United Kingdom. So they haven't actually created a new power and authority to replace that. They just run off their general acceptance.
Well, that's kind of the story of everyone here where I live, right? We're all lost at sea. That implies we're all dead, and yet everyone sitting here listening to this is living and breathing. So it's a similar thing. It's a world of fiction where people are pretending that things that have no existence do. But let me back up one more time here. If I followed the initial part of this conversation, the idea at hand was the Constitution was drafted honestly to protect living men and women from the Holy See. Is that correct? Did I get that right?
Essentially, yes. The Australian Constitution was drafted to, first and foremost, bring about laws for the society of people. And we set up a structure of government, which the people had ultimate control over through the Constitution. And all laws that stem from the Constitution were subject to that Constitution. And the check and balance, of course, was always the people. And it relied heavily on the people's knowledge of that Constitution in order to maintain the Parliament's ability to draft statutes stemming from that Constitution. And, of course, this has slowly been whittled away, and here we are today in a bit of a mess.
What they're trying to actually hide is that originally, prior to the Constitution being enacted at Federation, There were 6 colonies, and the 6 colonies joined as one sovereign, independent federation under the Crown of the United Kingdom, an indissoluble federation. And what happened in 1973 was they dissolved that federation under the Crown. And that's the problem. They never asked the people by referendum, which they needed to. And we have a clause in our Constitution, it's Clause 2, and it says that the Queen in the Constitution is the Queen within the sovereignty of the United Kingdom and no other. And if you go to the schedule where the oath is to that Queen, it says that only the name of the Queen of the United Kingdom can be changed from time to time. So in other words, each monarch's name from the United Kingdom can be changed. But there is no provision for this Queen of Australia, an alternate Queen under an alternate power. So what they've done, as we were stating before, there's been a couple of pieces of legislation that they've enacted. One's called the Australia Act and one's called the Royal Styles and Titles Act. And these 2 acts actually rise above the Constitution and essentially yielding the power and authority, which is just a corporate authority, once again, that's a general acceptance by the political parties. So you have this de facto government going on where they're hoping. It's like McDonald's. Okay, I'll put it to you like this: when I grew up, McDonald's was actually, it was a pretty good hamburger, but now they've actually taken everything out of that hamburger and replaced it with things that aren't actually food. And that's the same thing with government. They've replaced it, and what they're relying on is that you think it's the old system or the old hamburger, so to speak. So it's like many products that have happened these days. But yeah, the Constitution itself has been usurped by this corporate entity that yields no actual power and authority, and they just hope for this general acceptance that you haven't noticed that they've actually changed it by these corporate statutes. There's that deception going on once again.
Yeah, and in 1999 here in Australia, we had the last referendum that we've had out of those 48 referendums, and that was fairly well in your face. Do we go to a republic or do we stay with the monarchy? And overwhelmingly, the Australian people said, we'll stay with the monarchy, which pretty much undid all of their dirty work that they'd been conducting for the last 100 years. And they ignored it.
It was interesting with that referendum because what actually happened was the question was, do you want to replace the Queen and the Governor-General in the Constitution with a president? And the people said no. And that actually contradicted their Australia Act and their Royal Styles and Titles Act, which replaced that Queen that was in the Constitution. So in effect, not that it actually did, in effect, it nullified and confirmed that the people wanted to remain under the power and authority that's found in the Constitution and not this generally accepted truism of this corporate entity.
Well, then I've got to ask the obvious question here. I'm guessing you're not the only 2 guys in Australia who have a clue. People must have tried to take this to court or take what I'll call a meaningful measure to push back. And has that been done? And if so, what was the outcome? I mean, are your courts stacked or what's going on there?
Yeah, our courts are stacked. And one of the things they did in 1973, they first signed a treaty with Rome. Then they created the paper queen, and then they created a separate court system.
Hold on, I gotta jump in here with what you just said. Basically, if I understood what you just said, the Vatican took over your country.
Basically, yeah, and that was the first step. So in March 1973, our Attorney General, the Federal Attorney General, signed the Unidroit Treaty, which then allowed an intergovernmental committee based in Rome to oversee and draft all legislation under the heading of private law.
Wait a minute. You're telling me that all the statutes and laws under this kind of perverse corporate system that's called government, that's all being done in Rome?
Yeah, and there's 63 member nations, of which the top 25 form the executive arm of that body, of which Australia is on that executive arm. They draft all the private law. Now, Australia joined in 1973. America was already part of that in 1964. England went over to it, the United Kingdom, in 1948. So this private law body have been drafting pretty much all of the legislation ever since. And that legislation, and you can confirm all of this by getting onto the Unidroit website, which is where I learned all of this.
Are you saying that the United States is in the same situation? Did you just offer a date? When did the United States become part of the system you're describing?
They become part of it in 1964 and the United Kingdom in 1948, and they target specifically your legislative department. So here in Australia, it was our Attorney General. In the United Kingdom, it was the Department of Legislation and International Law, and I'm pretty sure it's the same with the United States. And from that point on, the architects to your legislation then take their instructions from this governing council based in Rome. And they have the articles for each one of those. So, for instance, laws around contracts, laws around negotiable instruments, banking, secured transactions, franchising, insurance, any civil procedure, civil liabilities, leasing, transportation, hotels, municipal law, marriage, even the legal status of women, and maintenance obligations. And recently, they've drafted articles relating to space. So they're now governing space.
Yeah, sure they are. We can imagine a Queen of Australia. Let's just imagine that. So I got to ask, man, they had to have had their foot jammed in the door. How did they do it? I'm guessing these countries didn't necessarily want to do what was brought to bear. I guess what I'm asking is, how the hell did they pull this off? They must have had some kind of leverage. If we're to go back to the beginning of this conversation, we're stating that the Constitution was drafted to basically protect living men and women from the Holy See, yet we're very early in this conversation, and we're pointing out that almost every country that matters is being governed by the not-so-Holy See. So how the hell did they do it?
It's been around for this influence since, I know for the United Kingdom, since 1215. The Treaty of Verona, 1213, gathered the Holy See gathered up the United Kingdom through King John and took the crown and leased it back to the United Kingdom, which they pay every year diligently. I think it's 1,000 guineas a year are paid. So they've been in the background, insidiously in the back corner of all of our governments, influencing them for hundreds of years. And
how did they do it, though? I mean, back then there was no video, so no one was getting blackmailed for playing hooky with a goat. I'm just trying to get down to we know how things are done in the modern era. There's a lot of that kind of thing goes on, but all the way back then, do you have any insight into what the crowbar was? What was the lever, the pressure?
Probably religion,
Yeah.
more than anything.
In 1946, what actually happened was they introduced the League of Nations, and UniJoint was an arm of the League of Nations, which was obviously a pre-runner to the United Nations, so the one world government. So now that's, as we know, that's been going on for a long time, hundreds, if not thousands of years. But it all began, or the last, I suppose, realm of it, bestowed upon every country, started when after World War One with the League of Nations, and it just, as I said, it was an arm of the League of Nations, and so people, once they joined the League of Nations, they've actually signed onto it by entering the League of Nations. So it sort of came along as an ancillary part of being a member.
The first attempt in the 20th century here in Australia was through the first beginning of the League of Nations through the Treaty of Versailles, which didn't really didn't get legs, because the sort of pseudo leader was our Prime Minister here in Australia, Billy Hughes, and he was a bit of a redneck, and he didn't really like the Chinese or the Japanese being part of this League of Nations, and they were very much wanting to be part of that. And because he wouldn't include them in that role, or that body, it sort of broke up, and then it was reformed again in the 40s. So, it's just been a gradual, in the 20th century at least, it's been a gradual takeover, but through a number of areas. But the world wars were essentially catalysts to bring about all of this influence through Rome, just through the back door. And of course, the banking world has been one of the main thrusts of power that Rome has been influencing, especially through the Jesuit arm and the neutral. Switzerland were really the first to start UniDroid off. I think it was around 1940, and then gradually they just and UniDroid was specifically set up to be the drafter of legislation, be the push for this private law. And it's the private law that we've really got to focus on, and therein lies the devil, separate to that of the public law, which is applicable to the society. Private law tends to find its foundation in the land or on the sea as such. But here in Australia, the legislation that really shows that up is relating specifically to, for instance, Australia and its territories rather than the people. And of course, all of this stems back in English law through the Cestui Que Vie Acts, which the first of which was under King Henry VIII, and then in 1666 under William and Mary of Orange, and 1707, Queen Anne. There's been a few others since, but the Cestui Que Vies bring in the dead entities, the true straw man entities, which we've been all pretty much labelled with. So it's been a gradual takeover over many hundreds of years.
Lost at sea philosophy.
Yeah, the lost at sea philosophy.
Yeah, it's so laughable, that we're even having this conversation.
Before we go any further with that, though, there's stuff that gets called patriot mythology. Are we blatantly saying at this point that there is legitimacy to all of this straw man identity information? Maybe not every single detail of it, but we are confident saying that is correct. Is that true?
Yeah, they just gave you the date.
I'm just trying to make it plain and clear because a lot of people like to argue about this stuff, and this is about as important as you can get, not to mention the fact that people will accuse, especially us, of not pointing out the fact that the Vatican and the Jesuits are at the heart of most of this, and we never disagree with that statement.
Yeah, this is legislation. It's written in law. We just work off what the law tells us. And it's black and white. It has been there insidiously in the background for hundreds of years. And you only have to look at the legislation to see how they killed us all off at birth. And they've created this capitis demonitio maxima, capitis demonitio minima, and capitis demonitio media. These three levels of corporate identity, and you see that today in the way that the name is laid down on paper. So that's the combination of uppercase and lowercase, and capitis demonitio maxima is the ultimate Roman slave, which is the all capitals name, and it's all there. It's in Black's Law Dictionary is another great source for that.
As I'm logically putting all this together, I'm starting, like Jason and I have covered the last time anyone declared war. You know, the United States likes to go bully people around and have a lot of wars. Last time they declared war was pre-64. Now I'm beginning to put one and one together. Is that because the corporation can't declare war? You know, we got to start thinking in these ways, don't we?
Yeah, in fact, they use the military codes. The Lieber Code is probably one of their foremost military codes that they use in order to take over governments. They move in by stealth. There's actual articles in your Lieber Code, 1863, that allow them to conduct this war in the background and take over countries in the background.
Oh, come on, Daryl, it's not a war. It's a peacekeeping exercise.
Yeah,
it's not a war.
It's good for the elephants, though, right? As long as it's good for the elephants.
Oh, yeah.
Sad but true, you know.